Hi, everyone. Welcome to our webinar, Acting on Your Data, from the Actionable Assessment series here at McGraw-Hill Education. Today, I want to talk about the idea of acting on your assessment data in a timely fashion and in a manner that helps move your instruction forward and helps your teachers understand how to adjust their instruction based on assessment results. One of the things that just some logistical things. If you have any questions along the way, if you could please use the Q&A box to ask those questions. That way I can help, it helps me see if anybody has any questions during the presentation. And there will be a few videos that we'll look at. And we'll just go ahead and get started here. So just to tell you a little bit about myself, I am the Director of Assessment and Research here at Aurora Public Schools. I've been in this role for 3 years, and I've been in the district for 7. Just some quick information about our schools here in Colorado. The enrollment last year was about 40,000 students, and it's about the same this year. Our students come from 131 different countries and speak 133 different languages. So as you can imagine, we have a lot of our English language learners here in our schools. 36% of those students speak English as a second language. 71% of our students receive free and reduced price lunch, and 10% of our students attend special education programs. Just a little overview of assessment in Colorado for those of you who are in other states, just so you can kind of see what's required here at the state level. We do an English language proficiency assessment every year for those ELL students. We comply with the Colorado READ Act, which mandates that we measure students' reading abilities in K through 3 with the idea that all students will be proficient in reading by 3rd grade. We have a kindergarten readiness assessment, and we have our state science and social studies tests, along with we are a member of the PARC Consortium, and we do administer the math and English language arts. This will be our 3rd year of participating in that testing. We also do the 10th grade PSAT, and this year starts for 11th graders the SAT. Previously here in Colorado it was the ACT, but they just made the switch over. So those are the mandated assessments. We also have interim assessments that we have our schools complete, and I'm not going to go through this whole timeline, but just so you can kind of see and maybe help compare with your experiences, how interim assessments have changed here in Aurora Public Schools over the years. We really started in 2002 and 2003 with the interim assessments, and things have morphed. We used commercial products for a while, then we switched over to developing our own, then we switched back to vendors, and we have been with the Acuity system since 2012, and we are still using that this year primarily for our grades 3 through 5, but we do have some of our students in grades 6 through 8 that are also using Acuity as well. So just to get a little bit of an idea of what kind of assessments you folks have used, there's a little quiz or a little survey for you. What assessments are you using or have you used? And this obviously is by no means an exhaustive list, but I was just go ahead and check any of those that you've used at any point in time, just so that we can all kind of see what different people are using. And I'll just give us a few minutes for everybody to be sure and check those. Okay, it looks like most of us have, I think maybe most folks have responded on the call. Okay, so yeah, so there's, somebody who's using Acuity, creating their own in the district, and then using other. And then I see one of our callers has used Ames Web and Star Reading, Star Math. There's a lot of them out there, right? I mean, it was one of those things I could have made this slide huge and, just tons and tons to list off. And there are a lot out there. And one of the things that I really emphasize to all the folks in my district is really, it's not the tool that you use, it's what you do with the data that that tool produces. And I think that that is really one of the most important messages that everybody needs to hear over and over again, because honestly, we have used several different systems, and there's good things and bad things and things that people like and things that they don't like about every system. But if they're not using the data, then it really doesn't matter what you use. So this is just going to give you a little bit of an idea about how we've been using the data, what we're doing here this year specifically. We started a little bit last year focusing more on how to use the data in the classroom level. And then, of course, the types of assessments, trying to have that comprehensive assessment system, or a balanced assessment system. So we certainly do encourage our teachers to use formative assessments, and that's something we've been working with them on creating things like exit tickets or different types of projects that can give them that formative information. And then the interim assessments, really using those as kind of a snapshot of progress. We do administer those. We require our schools to administer those in grades 3 through 10 3 times a year with an optional 4th administration. And then obviously the summative we save for our state required assessments. So one of the things that we try to emphasize is that really what we're trying to do is monitor along the way, because we've got a lot of baseline data for most of our students. We have maybe previous year scores, maybe sometimes we do some baseline, some screening, testing at the beginning of the year, and then those interim assessments help us along the way as we progress toward that final summative test to see where we ended up. And really the questions that we want to ask each time we use that snapshot is, are we moving in the right direction, and are we going at the necessary pace, and are we leaving anyone behind? And that's really important for our students, because we do have a wide range of abilities and learning levels in our classes, and so it's really important to make sure that no one is that no one is being left behind, that students are all progressing. And hopefully if some of our students are 1 or 2 grade levels behind, that we can help accelerate their learning to get them caught up. One of the things that we've done last year, and we're still continuing to do this year, is to focus a lot on the work from this textbook, the Driven by Data, and really understanding that standards are meaningless unless you define how you will assess them. And so everybody is teaching to standards, but those assessments are what is helping us understand our progress, and really understanding that assessments are not the end of teaching and learning process, they're the starting point. So we've really been emphasizing the fact that assessments are part of the teaching learning cycle. They're not separate from, they're not this distinct event that happens in a vacuum, that it's really part of the learning process, and it's how teachers can really help gauge their instruction. So this is one of the things that I tell everyone here in my district every time we do a training. So assessment is a tool or a measure, right? So just like, for example, you step on the scale and you see a number, you can see here it's the OMG, you step on the scale and you see a number, you don't like it. You want to change the number. And then what action do you take? If what you do for the next couple of weeks is lie on the couch and eat pizza and watch TV, then the next time you step on the scale, it's the same thing, and you think, wait, how can this be? Oh, it must be a bad scale. The scale must be bad. It's a bad assessment tool, right? There's something wrong with this tool. So then we think, okay, I'm going to go out and I'm going to buy a new scale, and it's not only going to measure weight, it's going to measure fat, body fat, right? So you think, oh, this is great. Now I've got this new tool. I've got this new assessment. I'm going to use this, and everything will be great. So we do that, but then our action stays the same. We continue to eat what we've always ate, we continue to, our activity level stays the same. Nothing really changes except for the fact that we stepped on the scale. Then when we step back on the scale, there's no change, right? Or potentially it could be worse. And we see this, and then we think, oh my gosh, do I need a new scale, right? There's fancy scales. Do I need a doctor's office scale? Do I need a different scale? Right, you would never do that. You would realize the fact that because you haven't actually changed your actions, the scale isn't, stepping on the scale isn't what's changing your body composition. It's what you do. It's your actions, right? I think we would all agree that that's how we would see that. But a lot of times that's what we do with assessments, and that's what I hear my teachers saying. That's what I hear my principals saying. They're saying, well, we don't like NW map, we want acuity. We don't like acuity, we want iReady. We don't like, they just kind of keep jumping from assessment to assessment. And that's really, I tell them, that's what you're doing. You're just buying a different scale. And we're doing the same thing. You're not changing instruction. You're not changing how you look at the data. You're not really informing teachers, and you're not giving them the power to understand what to do with that data. You give the test, you status quo, do the same thing as you've always done, and then move on. And so, again, we wouldn't expect there to be any difference. Oops, oh, my slide got stuck there for a second. So the act of taking an assessment is not where learning takes place. We are not going to teach by giving assessment after assessment. And I think sometimes we assume everybody knows that, but I think sometimes we forget and we get really quick to judge and think that there's something wrong with the tool that we're using. In a recent interview with John Hattie, he talked about really wanting to know anytime a teacher does a test, what did they learn about their impact? Who did they have the impact with? How would they maybe change instruction for groups of kids and individual kids? And that's really the purpose of assessment, and it's very powerful. So our focus here really is on using that interim assessment to drive instruction. And so one of the assumptions that we're making now is that we, and when I say we, I mean our principals and our teachers, are using that interim data within 48 hours of students completing the assessment. It doesn't do any good if you have an assessment window of 3 weeks and you test for all 3 weeks and then you spend a week or so maybe scoring items and then you look at the data, because by then it's been a month and who knows what else has happened, who knows how things may have changed. You maybe had students assessing at all different times. So we really focus on people getting assessments done generally within a week if possible, and then doing any scoring, making sure that everything's entered. Try to catch students for those makeups if they can, but if the students are gone for an extended period of time, then don't worry about catching them right away before you start analyzing the data. And that's one of the nice things with Acuity is that teachers can see their classroom data even if all the students haven't completed the test yet. So even if you do get a student who completes maybe a little bit later, they can still spend that time looking at that data and working with their lesson plans. So this is what we've done this year, is really the idea behind being able to act on your data is you have to have a plan. You have to know how you're doing things, and really in the beginning you have to create that schedule. And in that schedule we want to talk about baseline data. Do we have data from last year that we can review? When are we reviewing that? Is it in the first 2 weeks of school? Maybe it's even, some of our schools actually, our teachers usually come back a week before school starts. So they actually have some time where they get to look at their classroom data for their new classroom and really kind of see, okay, where are these students coming in? What do I want to focus on here in the beginning? What do I need to focus on? Where are they? Where might I be able to group some students? What kinds of activities could I do? Are there any interventions that might need to take place based on that? And then creating your assessment calendar. Again, like I said, we have 3 to 4 interim assessments during the year, and so they also know, we give them here at the district, we give them a calendar with all the state and other required assessments, and then we give them our windows, which are usually 3 weeks, but we recommend that they do all their testing within 1 to 2 weeks. And then give the teachers time for scoring. I know that Acuity this year is going to have some new tests that do not require hand scoring. They do not have the constructed response, but we in our district actually are still going to keep using the constructed response because we've really found that that's something that gives us a lot of really important information. And sometimes the teachers do balk at having to take that extra time, but what we recommend they do is to look at that as something, if they know that they're testing that week and they know they're going to have some constructed response to score, then maybe they don't do one of their other writing assignments that they were going to have students do that week, and then they spend their time going through those constructed responses with the rubric from Acuity and doing that scoring, and that's part of that work. So it's not an extra thing. It really is something that they're looking at, and not only can they look at it in terms of the rubric to score for the test, but they can also look at it for other things that they're maybe teaching. It's a great time for them to be able to get that student data and to be able to look at that. The other thing that we really, really insist on is that teachers have time to analyze the data. It's very frustrating when you tell a teacher you have to look at this data, but you never give them dedicated time. So some of the things, for example, actually tomorrow is for our elementary schools, it's a professional day, and so they will, several of our schools will be spending time looking at interim assessment data because we start really early in the beginning of August. And so most of our students have already taken kind of a baseline assessment, and so they're going to be looking at that data and working together and really looking to see where are there gaps in those students' learning. And the other thing, we also bring in our instructional coaches to look at, are there gaps in our curriculum? Does it look like maybe the way we've set up our pacing guide or what we're doing with our curriculum, maybe there's something in there that's leading to students having difficulty addressing some of those standards. And then the next thing that we do is we plan for reteaching. So once teachers and their principals and instructional coaches have sat down and looked at that data for the classroom, they really look and see what do we need to reteach, and what is that going to look like? Are there going to be small groups? Is it going to be whole class? How did the students perform? And then making sure that the teachers have the tools they need to do that reteaching. We all know that just reteaching is not simply doing the exact same lesson again for a second time. There was a reason why students didn't grasp that information. So really kind of figuring out how do they reteach and then give them the time that they need to plan and work together. So how are those teachers, how are they going to work together? Especially, we try to encourage the use in the professional learning community time so that they can look at the results. All the fourth grade teachers can get together and kind of see how their students did. Maybe if one teacher had better success in one area than others did, talk about what did they use for that particular lesson and those kinds of things. So when we look at the data reports, I really tell them not to focus on scale scores. People get very excited with looking at scale scores and then wanting to know what does that mean. And a lot of that does trace back to our state assessments where you have proficiency levels or you have expectation levels and kind of setting up where students are falling. But I try to encourage them not to focus on that, but to really look at the reports by standards. And again, Acuity has some really great, and I've got some examples here on the slides that are coming. They have some really great examples of how you can look at those, how students did by standard. And it really allows the teacher-to-teacher collaboration. They can work together on, they can look at a particular standard, see how their students did on that. It helps teachers work with their instructional coaches. It gives those coaches an idea of where to focus and maybe where to provide teachers those extra tools. And it also allows for the teacher-principal collaboration. Teachers and principals can work together as they're looking at that data, trying to decide maybe what teachers need to focus more on, or it kind of helps give some guidance for those teachers. The important thing to remember is that it takes time. There is just that's one of the things we hear frequently from teachers is that they just wish they had more time to look at these reports and to work with folks on them. So I know this is super tiny and you won't be able to see what all these standards are, but this is just an example of one of the favorite reports that our instructional coaches like to pull because it's what they call the matrix report, and it breaks everything down by question and standard. So the top That top row tells you which standard is being assessed with each question, and then in green are where the students got, so in the left-hand side are all the students, so it shows you in green where students got answers correct. So it gives you a really quick bird's eye view. It comes in, it downloads in an Excel file, so they can do a lot of different work. Teachers can do a lot of different work in terms of grouping and moving things around. The principals can actually download for all their classes, so they get a great big matrix report, and there are some ways that you can print it out so it prints only on one page, but it's not super tiny, so you don't need a magnifying glass to look at it. But this is one of the reports that they really like to look at because it really gives them that quick snapshot so they can see. And you can see in this report there's not a ton of green, right? I mean, this is definitely a problem, and you can see as you look at some of the particular standards, you can see that some have very few students who got those answers correct at all. So it gives a really quick place to go back and look at the standard and see how students were doing. So what I want to do is to watch, these are from Uncommon Schools, and this is a great resource if you haven't tapped into this already. There are a lot of really great videos that are really good to use in a lot of different professional development. But I want to watch this. This is a principal and the teacher, and of course they're using paper reports to review, but the nice thing about Acuity is you can look at them all online. So usually our teachers, if this was a video with our teachers, you would see them looking at their laptops together. But we'll just take a look at that, and you can kind of see what that looks like.
Next was fractions, multiplying fractions.
I saw that too.
And this is the beast right here. You can see how much more space it takes up in the table.
Why are meetings to analyze interim assessment data so important? They allow you to adapt your teaching to target what students didn't learn. Here, Jesse Rector is working with his math teacher, Paul Chin. At this point, Paul offers an analysis of why students didn't learn fractions effectively.
He said that the answer was 2 1/3, and I looked at it for a while. I was like, how could you possibly get that answer? And so then I realized what they did. They said that 7 times 7 was 14.
It's not?
So they were they actually did step 1 correctly. They turned the mixed numbers into proper fractions, but then they did 7 times 7 was 14. And I think it was Ashley Glover who did it during the Do Now review, and she went, oh.
This initial analysis is helpful, but watch as Jesse pushes Paul to probe even deeper. Not only do they do the analysis, but they plan how to reteach this concept more effectively.
So, but the biggest thing that I wanted to mention is that it shows a lack of understanding in terms of value estimation. And I think it's a weakness that we need to just address in general. Like I've done a poor job of this every year I've been here, like just making sure that kids really think about, does my answer make sense? Like in terms of just maybe rounding it to the nearest whole number and saying, okay, so it's about 2 times 3, so it should be about 6. You know, instead of getting 2 1/3, they should realize, wait, 2 1/3 doesn't make sense.
All right, so let's flesh that out for a second then.
Sure.
What are the what's the process then for them to say that my answer can't be 2 1/3 because this answer's got to be closer to, at least 6?
Yeah. So the process, I mean, again, I think a lot of it is because I'm just not giving them the tools.
Right. So what are the questions you ask them?
Then you realize, okay, so if they want to do value estimation, we should basically just train them how to round. So just training them to say, like, so what's 2 1/3 approximately equal to as a whole number? That kind of thing, and they should say 2. What's 3 1/2 approximately equal to as a whole number? And maybe they round up to 4, that's fine. But just getting them to understand you can just round the mixed numbers or round the decimals first and then perform the operation.
Right. So the steps are right. Like, or what you want them to do is right. So what I want to think about is some concrete action steps.
Sure,
so we can build that sort of level of like metacognition in them.
Yeah.
Jesse doesn't stop there. He continues to ask questions to get Paul to break it down into even tinier chunks of teaching to make sure that the reteaching is effective.
Yeah.
Or the modeling of this to look like so that students do this all the time.
Right. So I think what it starts with is we start with a worksheet that breaks down the steps of how you do it. So, step 1, round it to the nearest whole number. Step 2, perform the actual operation. And ask yourself and I guess step 3 would be ask yourself, does your answer make sense?
So what does the worksheet look like?
So I think it looks something like that, and then so maybe it's like split down the middle, where on the left it's the value estimation, and on the right it's the actual work, that kind of thing.
Sure. So what I think what needs to happen, because it's a direct instruction model, is that you need to
do the first one together.
Yeah, you need to, no, not together. I actually think
I just show them.
Right, the idea. And so in your lesson plan,
Sure.
You'll need to script out exactly what you're going to say for the I do.
These few minutes are some of the highest leverage in an entire school day. Together, Jesse and Paul have planned a targeted lesson to address exactly what students need. When done repeatedly, these actions cause student learning to skyrocket.
So when?
When is a great question. So I would like to do it immediately. I think I should just do it next week. So this is week 1?
Okay.
Yeah.
Great.
Hi, everybody. Sorry about that. My phone, I hit the wrong button and the phone disconnected. So from that video, you can see that they did a lot of work. They looked at the data. They looked at looking at those reports, and then looking how students scored, and then really talking about those concrete action steps. What am I going to do? How am I going to, tiny chunks of teaching. They talked about really creating very targeted lessons for the reteach. And so it was very specific with that, the data, but then you can see how quickly the data was important, but they moved on, right? You use that data, but then you move on and start doing the lesson planning. And so that's one of the things that's really important as they look at that data. This is another example of a report that we have folks look at in Acuity. It helps give, again, I know this is kind of small for you to look at, but it's nice because it really breaks down the standards on the left-hand side, so you can see the different content standards, and then you can see in the columns what percentage of students where the correct answers fell, so what percentage of the students did better. And so it's something that's really quick for the teacher to look at and see how students did, and then they can drill down, they can click on that particular standard. These are all hyperlinked, and so they're able to click on the hyperlink, and then it takes them into the standard. It shows them exactly it also shows them the question, which is very helpful. A lot of times they want to figure out if maybe there was something about the question wording, and that's something that we found really helpful with our teachers. I know there's a lot of other assessment systems out there that do not allow you to see the actual question, and that's something that frustrates some of our teachers, but Acuity does allow you to see the actual question. And then it also allows them to click on the group of students who scored poorly, and they can see exactly which students those were. And then it also has you can assign instructional resources straight from the system. So they can go in and they can assign some instructional resources targeted to that standard, specifically for those students who maybe scored a little bit lower than what they would have liked. This is another example of looking at an item, looking at specific items and seeing, you can actually see up at the top, these were the option choices. The correct answer is highlighted in green, and they can see, again, the percentage of students who picked the right answer. So they can actually click on so say, for example, in that first one, the students who answered A, which was incorrect, they can click on that link, and it takes them and shows them exactly which students it was that selected A. And then, I think this is my next one, It will also take them, you can look again at the question, you can see the correct answer, but the next slide, right, the next slide shows the distractor analysis, which our teachers have also found really helpful. So it shows you what the question was, it shows you the correct answer, and then it will tell you if students picked these wrong answers, this is potentially why. So in this example, they wanted them, what does the word fearsome most likely mean in that passage? The correct answer was A, but then if students chose B, hungry, it says the student chose a response that makes sense in the context without correctly using the root word as a clue. So for each one of those incorrect answers, it helps the teacher understand why the student picked that number or picked that answer, and it really can help when they're trying to do the lesson plan and the targeted lessons to help students. Remember, you want to make sure that you look at the root word before, as you're trying to determine what this particular word means. So this is a really nice feature that our teachers really like because they can look at this distractor analysis for each one of these questions. Now again, this obviously takes time. If you have a test that has 20, 25 items on it, this is going to take them some time to go through each one of these items. And they may not want to look at each item, right? There may be one item where only a couple of students picked the wrong answer, and so they may not spend a lot of time on that. But there may be one where half the students picked, letter B in this example, and so they know, okay, those students I really need to work with in terms of helping them understand to look at the root word as a clue. So this is another video that shows, again, that deep analysis, because it's not just when we talk about looking at your data, looking at data is important, but it really is also very important for them to be able to go deeply into that analysis. So I'll try not to hang up on everybody this time. See if we can get this one to play.
A big part of analysis is making sure we do deep analysis, figuring out the why that will allow us to attack the student error effectively. Here, first grade teachers and their grade level chair are analyzing student results on the STEP, on early literacy assessment. Jasmine noticed that the students are struggling with word solving. Let's look at their initial analysis and how it evolves.
So, in thinking about the lack of word solving right now is what it sounds like, which strategies do you think they are using?
They're using the initial sound, like Erin said. They're looking at that first letter, and whatever word could fit that sound. So not the meaning, not the syntax if it makes sense, just the first sound. That's their strategy.
To help us understand this issue, Jasmine provides an example.
So let's say Ibn, right? Ibn Karim. He went back and he's like, let's say it's frog, right? He's going fish, and he goes on reading. Go back, you said fish. Oh, frog. Okay, read that again. So he knew what to do easily, but I had to stop him. So for me, it's kind of like now getting them back into the mindset that this is how we read, and if you don't know what it says, it's not going to make sense, and now you don't know what the story is about anymore.
Right.
Now that they have identified this issue, Juliana asked Jasmine the best strategies to address this problem.
But if they know their blends, and it's actually coming from you, right? That we're talking about those initial sounds. If they're tight on those blends and those vowel patterns, then they're gonna be less likely to kind of sit there and try to figure out, well, what's FR? What's the FR? They should know that. So it's not even taking away. And so if they recognize the stories about frogs, and now that you've taken care of that.
Jasmine mentions focusing on letter blends like f and th, etc., that often occur at the beginning of words. But this strategy doesn't solve the issue that students aren't reading the middle and end of the word. Watch how Juliana uses a redirecting question to get them back to this issue.
So that's definitely great because we want them to read the blends quickly. But I can't help but think about where the blends are in the word. So you guys identified that they'll read the beginning, but then not finishing through the word. So what else could you incorporate into the word work that's going to get at that strategy of not only looking at the beginning, but also continuing through the end?
The chunking.
I think, speak more to that. What do you?
So definitely the chunking as well.
Now we've come to the root issue. Students are struggling with chunking, reading the different parts of the word and bringing them together. But the meeting doesn't end here. As the instructional leader, Juliana asks if the teachers have the strategies they need to teach this effectively.
And so you identified chunking as a strategy that you should do in your actual analysis, but it's not here in the implication. So putting that into the implication and then being even more specific about which chunks you're going to start to identify or exactly how you're going to do that. So I'm not sure if you would prefer to do like, okay, we're going to introduce these chunks, or if you're going to do it more from like a procedural thing of like we're teaching them how to identify the chunk. Do you know what I mean by that, by as far as the procedural part of it?
I haven't really done chunking, to be honest. The way I interpreted chunking was just any longer word or any word.
Right.
Okay, first sound, what's that sound? Second sound. So I don't know what the kind of like the breakdown of this is how we chunk or this is.
So if we have this word here, wonderful, right? So you teach them to look for the vowels.
The meeting ends with the instructional leader coaching the teachers around the strategy that will have the biggest impact in their upcoming lesson. So we've moved from teachers teaching reading generally, which has some impact, to choosing exactly the strategy that will improve learning tomorrow. When a teacher does this repeatedly, day after day, the learning improves dramatically. Only deep analysis allows for that to happen.
Okay, so you saw how in that video, again, they can look at the data to see where there's a potential problem, but then they really you have to dig deeper. They have to really understand what the root issue is, why students are answering particular questions incorrectly, and then go forward and then be able to work on those targeted strategies that really are going to address that particular root issues. So again, they started with the data. They look at, okay, here's how students were responding, but then they quickly moved, determined that root cause. Why are students answering that way? What's going on? And then went on to talk about, here's the strategies we're going to use, here's the lessons we're going to use, and here's how that's going to work. So those are the kinds of meetings that our instructional coaches have with our teachers as they look at that data. They can really help our teachers be able to understand what those root issues are, because sometimes the teachers aren't quite sure. So that's a great way for the instructional coaches, teachers to look at the data and then move forward and make that impact in the classroom. So some other important considerations with doing this kind of work in the schools is support from leadership is crucial. And I'm talking not only about principals, but also other building leaders. Maybe some of the teacher leaders, also looking at district leaders. Again, I'm the director for assessment for the district, but I do a lot of work. I go into the schools. I sit down with the teachers sometimes. I sit down when they're doing their meetings with the principals, when they're doing their meetings with the instructional coaches, and make sure that they don't have any questions specifically around maybe some of the logistics of the assessment or some of the reports that they don't understand looking at some of those numbers. The other thing that we do really encourage is to work with data from the multiple sources. So not just the interim assessment, but what other assessments have they been using, especially around those formative assessments. So for example, we had one teacher who was really confused because their student was doing poorly on the interim assessment, but they had been doing really well on the formative assessments. So they were able to bring in those formative assessments. They were able to pull up that student's interim assessment and really work directly with that instructional coach to figure out what was going on. And actually what was really happening was the student was getting frustrated when they were taking the test online and weren't really clicking. They were kind of clicking through on some things. So it wasn't that they didn't understand. It was that the system itself, taking the test online, was actually causing the problem. If they would have just looked at the interim assessment, they might have thought that that student needed some specific guidance in that area, when really the formative assessment said, no, that doesn't seem to be the case. Let's really dig a little bit deeper. So it's really important to have that. And then also if they have that summative data, to see if those things, if all three of those, the formative, interim, and summative assessments, seem to triangulate and point to the same picture, or again, if there's some key piece, because a lot of those formative assessments our teachers give are specifically pencil paper or something that they do right then in class, but then the interims and the summatives are online. And so we have found that we do need to make sure that our students are able to navigate the online systems and have some strategies for reading and can use some of the different accessibility features to make sure that they're able to do their best on the test. The other thing that we try to do is to find multiple ways to present this data to teachers. So obviously the assessment system usually has multiple reports in it. Like I just showed you a few of the acuity reports. There's other ones. There's a lot of other reports in there that kind of slice and dice that data a little bit differently. But we also like to be able to, we use the Tableau system for a lot of our test data in conjunction with attendance data, behavior data, that kind of thing. So sometimes teachers can find a more holistic picture when they're looking at assessment data alongside attendance data or those kinds of things. And sometimes we do print things out, right? Like you saw in some of those videos, they were looking at papers. Sometimes some people just really like to have that pencil paper experience. They like to be able to, make notes on the paper, those kinds of things. And so being able to respect the teacher's need for that, we do print out some of those reports as well, just making sure they understand sometimes the functionality of the hyperlinks within the reports won't work that way. And then training the teachers how to look at that data and how to act on it. So what do they need to do? How can they look at that on their own? Making sure that we scaffold that process with them, not just saying, okay, now go pull your reports and look at your data. And then just like in the videos, really sitting down and working with them, how do we act on this? And really trying to make sure this isn't seen as just another thing teachers have to do. Making sure that they understand this isn't extra, this is a supplement, this is an enhancement to what you're already doing. It shouldn't be an extra thing. It's not going to go away. And really help them create processes and structures within the school building to do that. One of the things we also have, in addition to some of our elementary school professional release days, we also have late start Wednesdays frequently in a lot of our schools. So teachers are able to spend the mornings working with other teachers and going over that data. And here's just a few other ways that we've used the assessment data, looked at the assessment data. We during those principal teacher meetings, I think like I had talked about, in the PLCs, those professional learning communities, really working on having them share examples of student work. That's been one of the most powerful pieces that we've seen, is when they're actually able to bring student work in. And it can be from the test, it can be from one of the constructed response questions. They bring that in. They pass that around. They work on inter-rater reliability in terms of scoring. It's really helpful for them to see different examples and what other teachers are doing with that. And then with our instructional coaches, again, it helps them when they look at the data to see if there's any gaps in the curriculum or if there's any supplemental tools or different types of resources that they want to make sure that they give to our teachers. The other two things that are still relatively new here, but we are working to incorporate, is, what a surprise, we could actually share this data with the students themselves. Acuity student can log in, they can see their report, they can sit down with the teacher, they can go over the different standards, they can go over how they answered, they can look at all of that information themselves, and they can really work for what, understand, what do I need to work on. Our district strategic plan is that every student will have a plan for their future, and so one of the pieces is that this, looking at interim data, looking at the summative data, students should be able to look at that and see what they need, and then be able to help shape their plan, decide what kinds of help that they want, and then additionally share it with parents, right? Being able to work with parents on, back to school nights, anytime parents come in. Some of the, Acuity has an at-home portal that parents can log into. There's some of the other ones that have at-home pieces where parents can log in and see. So it really provides a good way for us to be able to work with our students and our parents in addition to our teachers, because we need everybody to help us make sure that those students are moving forward in their learning. So a little bit about the then and now of the district and how we've really moved with acting on our data. Before, we really focused on predicting to the state test. So we took our students took the state test, or they took the interim assessment, and we would get a score that would predict how well they would do on the state test. We don't do that anymore. We don't look at that. Acuity does offer that. They're going to offer that with these new readiness tests, but we're really focused much more now on immediate use of the data to inform instruction. We also, unfortunately, in the past did use data to rank teachers in schools in order of level of performance, the infamous data walls, where teachers in their classrooms and schools and those kinds of things were ranked. We don't do that anymore. We really spend a lot of time conducting data discussions with teachers to look at those areas of strength and where we want them to focus for improvement, specifically looking at that class item analysis and distractor reports to really help them understand what they need to do to move forward. And another thing we used to do with interim tests is the teachers would test because it was on the schedule. Okay, now it's time to do our interim test. We do that. We did it on schedule. We never looked at the data. We never did anything else with it. It was just something that was on the schedule. And now we really emphasize, if you don't have a plan for using the data, we don't want you to actually get the test. There's really no point in moving forward and doing that if you're not going to look at the data. And then my little picture below, my little photography now and then. Before, when we had cameras with film, 24 pictures we took, 24 pictures were developed, and 24 pictures were looked at. Now with our phones, we take 4,000 pictures. We don't develop anything, and we don't look at them. And so that's not what we want. That's not the direction that we want to go with our assessment data. I would rather give fewer assessments and look very deeply at the data than to just give more assessments and never really look at the data. So it's important to remember that there are some things that data can and cannot do. The data is not a force unto itself, and I really try to avoid data for data's sake. Just having data to put up on a wall doesn't do anything. It's not a perfect reflection of reality. Sometimes students don't take the assessment seriously. Sometimes, again, like the click-through, really remembering that it's just it's a point-in-time measure, so it doesn't give the entire picture, and recognize that other things may be just as important. Just because we don't give a pencil paper or a computer assessment doesn't mean that there's some other things that we don't want to pay attention to. The data does not speak for itself. Surprisingly, you can't just run some reports and print them off and have something happen. People actually have to know how to look at those reports, know how to interpret that data, and they may need additional context. Data is not power. Just like assessment is an instruction, looking at the data doesn't make things happen. So again, just because I could spend hours looking at all the different reports, looking at looking at everything, printing reports out, making data walls, et cetera, but that in and of itself isn't what's actually going to make the change in student learning. So really moving to, okay, I looked at the data, I see what's happening, and now I'm going to go forward, and now here's my plan. Here's my lesson plan. Here's my targeted lesson. Here's the action steps that I'm going to take based on that data. And then interpreting data requires training. Don't just assume teachers or principals know what it means. I see that a lot. They kind of slap down, here's a report, and they assume that teachers or principals know how to do something with that or how to even understand what those numbers mean, and so they don't. So make sure that you are spending time helping folks understand how to use that data. Oops, went a little too fast there. And again, my final note is really remember, if you're not going to use the data, don't bother to administer the assessment. It's a waste of your time. It's a waste of the student's time. The data really is where you can get that information and then create that action plan. So that is my presentation on acting on your data, some of the things we're doing here in the district. Does anybody have any questions or comments? You can type those in either, because I saw some of you put some things in the chat box for some of the different, I'm not familiar with is it Alex testing? I do know STAR, some of the different STAR assessments, but if anybody has any questions, you can type that in the chat box or the Q&A box. I will say this hasn't happened overnight, and we're certainly not perfect with acting on our data. Really, things started to change and shift focus last year, and now we are continuing to make really important strides in this, but it's not an overnight thing. We still have teachers who don't want to spend time grading constructive responses, don't understand why they should have to give an interim assessment, don't like the interim assessment. But I will tell you, we actually had one of the Acuity trainers come and do a presentation on data reports, and everybody was very excited with it. We actually had one person tell us afterwards, I brought one of my teachers and she hates giving these assessments, but after seeing these reports and seeing what she can find out and seeing the kind of information that she gets, she's excited and she wants to go back and lead a training with the other teachers on how to use these reports. So that was really exciting for us to be able to get that information. I see there's a question about, there was a couple slides that you'd like to see again. Will it be available? That is something that I will have to ask my McGraw-Hill folks. Oh, and Antonio is answering. So you will get a link to the recording. Excellent. Does anybody else have any questions? Well, thank you all very much for tuning in. I think, like Anthony said, you'll get an email with a link to the recording. If you have any questions, I think my contact information, I don't know for sure if it's on there. It may be. You can probably find me if you Google me. Please feel free to ask. I'm happy to talk with anyone about the work that we're doing here to help our students succeed. So thank you very much, everyone, and have a great day.